How's it going, everyone? I'm Sean and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking to you about one of my favorite tools in the workshop, this glorious beast right here, the bandsaw. Bandsaw is one of, if not the most useful tool to have in any woodworking workshop, especially a guitar building workshop, except when it's not set up properly. If you've got a dull blade, a bent blade, if the fence isn't set correctly, it's not as useful at all. In this video, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about bandsaws, including how to set them up, how to change the blade, all the bits and pieces of it, and how to adjust them. So grab yourself a nice hot cup of tea, coffee, whatever you want, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Before we get into the video, it's very, very important to take a minute and just talk about PPE and safety while working on pretty much any machine, but the bandsaw in particular for this video. It's important to note that anything I'm going to be doing here, any adjustments or anything I'm doing on the blade or internally with the bearings, any of that, I will be turning off this bandsaw at the wall, making sure that there is no power to it, that I can't accidentally bump the switch and, chop my fingers off. This is potentially a very dangerous machine. This will lop my finger off and it won't stop, it won't slow down while doing it. It's very important to know this. I think it's valuable information, and keep it in mind as you work on it that this thing will hurt you. So do your due diligence, pay attention, know what you're doing, and watch out for the sharp pointy bits. Seems simple, but there you go, worth saying it. I'm also, whenever I'm going to be using it, I have hearing protection right here, and I've got glasses. You should also wear a mask whenever you're doing any kind of woodworking. It kicks up dust, which gets into your lungs, and lungs don't like dust. So keep that one in mind as well. With that said, let's get stuck in. Let's start looking at the actual bandsaw. What are all the bits and pieces and how is it made up? These are important because you need to know all the terms of everything we're going to talk about. First things first, and this is always the very first thing I tell absolutely everybody whenever I'm showing this. This big yellow thing here on my one is a blade guard. Might be different on every bandsaw, but every bandsaw should have one of these. It also houses the bearing carriage down underneath here, and it just, well, as the name implies, the blade guard guards the blade from your hands. That's important. We then have an upper housing, which this one has a lock on the side and opens up. You can see we've got a large cast iron wheel in here that spins around and actually holds the blade. We've got a matching one underneath, which looks the same, basically, but that one also houses the motor in there. Inside the upper housing, we've got our large cast iron wheel. We've also got a switch up here. This may not be a standard feature on every bandsaw out there, but a lot of them should at least have this. This basically means that with the door open, you cannot turn on the machine. It's a pretty good safety feature. Sometimes these do get a bit stuck and gummy. You get dust inside of them, so if you ever have a problem with a bandsaw not turning on, check the switches. We've also got a couple of other little things in here. We've got a blade tension guide back there, which honestly is a little bit useless. I completely ignore it. And well, that is about it for inside. Let's have a look in the back. There are a couple of more important adjustments back here that are not always used, but you need to have them. Starting over here, we have these two work together. This is a lock for the blade guard. It's very important not to over tighten this. It does not need to be done up very tight. If you over tighten that, then over time it'll wear it away, and that's not great. So that needs to be loosened, and then we have a crank here, which can be used to raise and lower the blade guard, which, well, is necessary because you need to adjust this every single time for the piece that you're going to use. And then you lock it off, and it's ready to go. Moving over, this bandsaw is equipped with a quick release, which is a tension to basically, when I move that, it drops the wheel down, which releases tension on the actual blade itself and allows you to remove it a lot easier, a lot faster. And you can hear the tone of the blade, that's quite cool. This is then a fine adjust for the tilt of the upper blade. So effectively that is a screw that goes into the back of the blade, thereabouts, and it adjusts the angle of which it's sitting in there. It's important for adjustments later on. We'll get to it. Lastly, up here, we have the actual blade tension adjustment, which, again, another necessary thing. All of these may differ based on your own bandsaw, but you should be able to adjust the tilt of the blade, you should be able to adjust the tension, and you should be able to adjust the blade guard if you have one. Moving down to the actual blade guard and the bearing carriage, we have some adjustment knobs here, which if I loosen this, it springs out this side bearing. This is what I call a side bearing. We have this guy here, which actually adjusts the entire bearing carriage back and forth. That's usually not necessary, but again, good to have. And this knob here actually adjusts another bearing, which sits behind the blade, like that, in that orientation, which is what we call a thrust bearing. You can see the thrust bearing from the back like this. The blade guard unfortunately obscures what's going on, but hopefully you can see exactly what is actually going on there. Underneath the bed of the bandsaw, we have a very similar bearing carriage set up here. You can see the thrust wheel a lot easier on this one. And under there, we have some more side bearings. We also, if we rotate around, have a bed angle adjustment, which is quite valuable. Lastly, this crank here adjusts the tension of the motor belt, and there's your motor, and there is your extraction. The only other things are we have these windows here and here, which allow us to see internally and see how the blade is running on the actual wheel. Now that we're happy with the anatomy of the bandsaw, I hopefully have covered absolutely everything on this. Let's get stuck into it. This particular blade is a little bit knackered. So first things first, to set up your bandsaw, you got to pull off the old knackered blade. This one, because it has its quick tension release, I'm going to reach in behind it, and it was that lever. I just flick it over and down she comes. This wheel, you can see if I move it back, that wheel is moving up and down. Next, I'm just going to pull the blade off the wheel itself and be careful with it. And I need to be very careful here with my blade guard and feed it through. There's also a slot on the side here that needs feed through. And that is it. The blade is off. This particular bandsaw as well also has a little safety guy here. It's a little L bracket of steel that fits into a slot between the slot and the bed. It helps to keep the table aligned because it has, well, a big slot milled through the middle of it. And, well, it prevents the blade from coming out, so that does need to be removed beforehand. Next, we need to grab our new blade, which I have right here. It's exactly the same blade. This is a 1/4 inch, I don't know, 4 TPI or something like that. It's not a very fine blade by any means. It's not a very thick blade, but this works beautifully for what we need and does a great job at resawing as well. Now, opening these can be a bit daunting. I would absolutely recommend do not just take this and throw it on the floor like a lot of other people do. That's, I don't think, a very safe way of doing it. Carefully open it like this, unfold it, and away she goes. So just nice and carefully open it, unfold it, and try not to let it spring. Now, to actually install this, it's very, very similar to uninstalling one, which is I'm basically going to bring it in to here. I've put in that stopper, so pop that back out. And then nice and carefully feed it through the slot in the bed, bringing it up and through the slot on the side. And just very carefully try not to let the actual teeth hit into the body of the bandsaw or anything like that. Once it's on the upper one, I'm going to reach down below and make sure it seats onto the lower one. There we go, I'm happy with that. And then I'm going to reach behind and tighten this back up. So that has raised up this wheel. Now, just to make sure it actually gets settled, I'm going to just reach onto the wheel and spin it around. So now I'm happy enough that it's actually seated on the wheel where it wants to be, more or less. At this point, I want to set the actual tension of the blade, and I'm going to do that by looking at the area here. And I want to be able to push the blade over with one finger and make it touch the casting, but I want to work for it. So on this one, if I push, this is getting quite difficult now, and it's still not touching. So in my head, this is actually too tight. So I'll reach above, and I'm going to simply loosen this tension adjustment a little bit, and then do my test again. So now I can make it touch, but you can't really see, but my fingernail is going white as I'm touching, and it's really kind of digging into the flesh of my hand. So I'm actually quite happy with that. It touches, but it's difficult to do so. I'm going to respin this just to make sure it seats nicely. With my tension good, I will now spin it around. And as we can see through this window, we can see where the blade is actually sitting on the wheel. These wheels are cambered, they're not actually flat, and they sit on a polyurethane lining or whatever it's called, which first of all helps grip the actual blade, but also is soft, because if you had this running on cast iron, you would just shred your blade in about 10 seconds. And I'm going to just make sure I'm happy with where it's actually running. This one, you can kind of see that the blade itself is pretty centered. What I am looking for is the gullet of the blade, which the blade is made up of teeth, which are the pointy bits that point out, and the gullets, which are the areas between the teeth. So it's the little valleys in the middle of the sharp points. And I want those gullets running as close to central on the wheel as possible. So this one is pretty good, but I would think that it's running just a hair too far forward. So I'll reach back to my tilt adjustment, which is this guy back here, which we looked at earlier. There's a lock on this one, which I'm going to loosen off. And I can never remember which way this goes, so I'm going to tighten it about a quarter turn, and I'm going to see what that does to the blade. Got it in one. The blade has moved back just enough, and now the gullet of the blade itself is riding in the middle of the wheel. I'm very, very happy with that. So I will tighten back up this lock and just make sure that that doesn't move again. Now that I'm happy with the tension and also where the blade is actually running on the wheels, I need to look at the bearings. So first things first, what I'm looking for is I want these side bearings, both of them, to be running just behind the gullet of the blade. And you can see on this one, hopefully, that after our little adjustment, these wheels are running ever so slightly too far forward. They're pretty much on the gullet or slightly in front. So I'm going to hold these here, and I'm going to loosen the actual carriage lock, which is on the other side, and I'm going to just pull this back until this bearing is riding just behind the gullet. Next thing, I'm going to loosen the lock on this bearing, and this one has a little push adjuster there, and I'm going to push this in until it's almost touching the blade. To check what it's doing, I'll move it, and you can see here the bearing actually moves. I don't like that. So I will move it just out a hair. And I effectively want this as close as humanly possible without the blade actually touching the bearing. So I'm happy with that. I will do the exact same thing on the other side. Lastly, to set all of our bearings, I'm going to set our thrust bearing, which is the one on the back of the carriage that you really can't see with this blade guard, unfortunately. So I'm going to reach around, loosen it, and then I'm going to basically push this forward until it just about touches the blade, which if I remove my hand, you can see that. And to test it, you can simply reach forward, touch the blade. We can see that moves, so I'm going to pull it forward. We do want it to move a bit, but the less movement we have, the better. So now when I check it, you can see it and you can hear it that it is moving, but it is less than a millimeter of play. I'm very, very happy with that. After adjusting all of that, all the bearings and everything, I just need to repeat what I've done on the upper carriage to the lower carriage down here, which is a lot more awkward to get into. So I'm not actually going to film that bit, but it's the exact same premise. Get the side ones as close as possible without touching, and get the thrust bearing as close as possible without touching. To check, I will plug the machine back in, set it running, and just check all the bearings, make sure nothing is actually touching, and see if I can adjust anything any closer. But other than that, pretty much happy to call this done. And then we get into setting the fence. But this should be everything to actually get your bandsaw up and running and cutting really, really nicely. If you do all of this, you're going to get some good cuts. So let me set those, we'll check everything, and then we'll get going with the fence, because I've got a really, really good way of doing it that I think will help a lot of people out there. That bearing needs checking, it's just ticking ever so slightly. This one looks good, and the one up above also looks good. Go below, and everything looks pretty good down here as well. I'll adjust that one bearing, and then happy days. Before we wrap everything else up, there is one last adjustment we need to do, and that is make sure that this blade is actually square to the table. So we need a square, a known square. I know that this little adjustable square is actually square. Something you do need to check, funny enough. So I'll be using this. An engineer's square, anything like that will work fine. So I'm going to adjust the blade guard up so that I can actually get the square in there. So unlocking at the end and cranking it with the wheel. What I will do, I'll bring my square right up to the blade, making sure that if there is any little wobble or inconsistency here, which there is a hair on this one because these plates are quite often a little bit low, making sure to keep my pressure on the back of the square so that it stays referencing the actual bed. I'll bring it up and check it against the blade. And we can see on this one I'm touching at the top but not at the bottom, therefore my bed needs to be adjusted. I will do that with the crank at the back of the bed, which is back here, and I shall just move the crank until I can get it spot on square. I'm pretty happy with that. That is as close as we're going to get. The last adjustment we have left is the fence, which is one of the best additions to a bandsaw if you've got a decently working fence. One important thing to know about a bandsaw is since it is a band of a saw that rides along cambered wheels, it is very, very difficult to actually set it to go in a straight line in the direction exactly that you want. Which means that basically every blade has its own way that it wants to run true and straight. And this is different from every single blade to every other blade. Every time I change a blade, I have to reset the fence. It doesn't matter that it's exactly the same blade from the same supplier and the same batch and all this, it runs different. It just always does. They're very, very difficult to get running straight and true to the bed of your bandsaw with its lovely cast T-track and everything in there. And unfortunately, I have never used it. I probably never will because it's a lot easier to set the fence to run square to the blade than it is to make the blade run square to everything else. So to do this, we need a couple of different things. Literally a couple, I just need two things. I need a sliding bevel, and I need a big block of wood. Doesn't matter what this is. I cut this out of a, what's that, like 2.5 inches by 4 inches, thereabouts, bit of beech. Doesn't really matter what it is. What I did was I took this, I milled it nice and straight and square across all 4 faces. And then I picked a side that I called reference, which is this side. And I drew a lot of lines that are parallel to this reference face across the entire block. On this one, I've gotten 8 or 9 lines out of it. And as I've been going, I got stuck on one line, annoyingly. So I had to cut out of it. So that's why there's a large chunk missing. But usually I don't cut these down at all. What we're going to do is basically use this, push it through the actual bandsaw blade until I can follow one of these lines nice and comfortably. And you can feel the bandsaw when it wants to be going straight. If you're able to just push nice and leave evenly, whatever that angle is that you're pushing straight at, that is the angle that your blade wants to run straight to. And then we are going to use the sliding bevel to set the fence to this face. This will all make perfect sense once you see me do it in a minute, and it is so simple and so effective. These blocks last a long time as well. The taller you can have them in this face, the better, because it'll give you a more accurate representation of what the bandsaw is actually wanting to do. But this will last forever. I made this one over a year ago, maybe 18 months ago in fact, and I'm not even halfway through. I can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 lines and a half done, and I still have 5.5 left, and now it's 18 months. So I should get 3 years out of this, basically. And I change these blades relatively often because this is the Crimson Guitar School of Luthiery, and we've 2 bandsaws here, and we change blades every 3, maybe 4 weeks. So we go through a lot of blades here, and this block is still going strong 18 months later. So I'm going to get started with this. I'm going to pop in my hearing protection, get my goggles on, and start cutting this block. And you'll see, once I'm comfortable that it's running straight and true, I'll turn off the bandsaw, hold it in place, set my sliding bevel to it, and then I will set the fence to it. The fence has a couple of adjustments on the side. You'll see me adjusting them, and once they're set, I will lock them down hard, and I will make sure that they don't move. Before we actually set the fence on this, I want to make sure that it's square. That is a very important thing here. So again, I'll pull out my square, pop it up against it. Perfect, happy days. If I did need to adjust it, these are a little bit of a nuisance. The rail that we have on the front here is attached with 2 bolts. And those bolts are actually in slots, so you can loosen the bolts and move the entire rail up and down. And by changing the angle of the rail, you change the angle of the fence. Quite easy to do, but it requires a little bit of back and forth. Once you're happy that the rail is set nicely and that the angle is set, we can move on to actually setting the fence to run square to the blade. It's important when you do this to make sure that your bandsaw fence is actually locked off onto the rail down here. And if it is, then we're good to go. Because basically, if I loosen this and move it around a little bit, we can see there's some play. When I lock it off, that play can straighten just ever so slightly. So it's very, very important to make sure before you set the angle on this, that it is actually set. So on this one, we can see it is, hopefully you can see on that, it is touching at the tip up here, but not back here. So I need to move this fence that way. I'll do that by unlocking down here and also unlocking down here. You can see my warning, please don't move. This is a school, we get people who don't know what they're doing. As I move this guy, you can see it moves the angle ever so slightly. And I will just move this until, there we go, I'm now happy with that. I'll tighten that off a little bit, and then I'll tighten this one off a little bit. And then I will check, we're still level up to it, and tighten these right down. That's still good, and we tighten that, we tighten that. And that fence is now set. And with the fence being set, this bandsaw is now ready to rock. It is cutting sweet as a nut, dead straight. We can do tests and everything all day long, but this is now ready to resaw tops, resaw whatever you want. And that is great. If you follow all of these steps, you should have a bandsaw that runs just as well as this one. And I hope you do. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it. I hope it all makes sense to you and that you can translate everything that I've shown you onto your own machine and it works brilliantly for you. Let me know down in the comments below, is there anything else you do differently that works really, really well for you? Because I'm always looking to improve things and I think we all should be. So please let me know. If you did enjoy it, if you learned something from it, please head down below, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, all of that good stuff, the bell notification, all of that. YouTube loves it and I love it too. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you all again real soon.